New fossil fuel and renewable technologies are transforming relationships across the Atlantic. From Massachusetts to Morocco, solar panels and wind parks provide solutions to the challenges of energy scarcity and climate change, while more efficient and responsible production of fossil fuel resources continue to change the energy sector. These energy developments are especially vital in the southern Atlantic, where access to energy is essential for improvements in healthcare, education, entrepreneurship, and economic growth. To build momentum in the South, regional and international cooperation is crucial. What are the best practices for cooperation on renewable energy, fossil fuels, and research and development? How can northern and southern Atlantic countries work together to improve energy security and access across the Atlantic basin?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the stage the world editor of the Miami Herald, Mr. John Yearwood.
Hello again. We're about to talk about an exceedingly important topic, and we have a great group of people who are going to help guide us through this conversation. A few ground rules. One of the things that I think is really important when we discuss issues, particularly of the nature of energy, I want to get the audience very much involved and very much engaged because you've stuck with us throughout the day, and clearly you're here because you have a passion or a deep interest in this topic. So if you have any questions, we would like to get those questions answered. And secondly, I think if you have your Spot Me devices, we're going to use those a couple times during the course of this, the next hour and 15 minutes. So get those ready. In fact, why don't we get them ready right now? The first question, if we pick up the premise of what's on the program, is an Atlantic energy system emerging? And I'd like to ask you guys that question. If you can go into Spot Me and let us know what you think. Is there an emerging Atlantic energy system? Or maybe two, or maybe none. But if you can, you have 15 seconds to let us know what you think. Do you believe there is an emerging Atlantic energy system? Okay, you've got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1, time's up. Okay, let's see. Wow. Fascinating results. So, given those results, I think it makes our conversation here even more interesting. And we'll start with Amina. And why don't we ask you the very same question? Is there, you think, an emerging Atlantic energy system?
I think that things are changing, and there is promising patterns for the Atlantic basin for several reasons. The first one is this area holds mainly 40% of world-proven reserves, 2/3 of unconventional and deep offshore, and mainly 2/3 also of renewable energy. So this area is largely promising, and we have seen large innovations on the last decade with the shale revolution, the new technology in the deep offshore exploration with new era appearing, especially in the Atlantic coast of Africa, from Guinea Equatorial to Angola with the deep offshore. So all this is bringing new patterns, is changing the production pattern, is changing the trade flows. And with this gas revolution, we have seen large change in the areas of producing countries in the southern Atlantic basins, especially in Africa, where production initially that has to go to the US is no more going there, and they have to buy it to Asia or to buy it as spare capacity. So things are changing with level of reserves, with new discoveries, with innovation and technology that have largely bring. Can we speak about renaissance? I don't know, because we have also in the south large needs for energy, especially in sub-Saharan countries, and we have big challenges to face in the future.
Excellent. So you're in the yes column. Robin, what do you think?
Well, I'm not sure what an energy system is. So let me, I'll come in the yes column, but I'll come in a different way. Let me define an energy system. Energy is a function. First thing I like to say, energy is one of those words like love and finance. It means different things to different people. To some, it's natural gas, some it's oil, some it's coal, some it's solar. These are very, very different businesses. But they're all a function of technology, markets, regulation, resources. There are a whole bunch of factors. And in a sense, there is a system of mobilizing all these different factors. And if they're in place, if the proper factors are in place, they can work very, very efficiently. And if they're not in place, there is no system, and they're completely disjointed. And for example, if the international industry is not going to invest in countries where the terms are not attractive. There are certain, for example, renewable technologies that are very challenged. And some of these renewable technologies, with all due respect, are irrelevant unless they're scalable and economic. A lot of people like the idea, but they're not familiar with the economics. So I guess my answer is sort of.
Well, we've got a sort of, maybe yes, sort of. Robin, how about you? No, Winston, how about you? What do you think?
I think I agree with him that an energy system is an elusive concept. But if you define it as the Atlantic Basin as a hub, then I'm on the yes, but field. Yes, on the renewables. I mean, we produce, the Atlantic Basin produces today over 2/3 of the hydropower outside China. About 90% of the biofuels, and about over 50% of the wind energy. But renewables don't pay the bill. I mean, you have to look at fossil fuels as well. And that's a pity, because the trends, when you look at trends in renewables, the picture is even better, because Africa is going probably to take the ball from Brazil and the United States on the biofuels. There'll be a huge development over time, obviously, depending on institutional conditions, of hydropower, both in Africa. 70% of sub-Saharan hydropower potential is undeveloped. And Brazil is just starting to play the Amazon game, where we have huge water sources. So this part of the world as a hub of clean energy is very, very fine. It won't pay the bill. We have to look at fossil fuels at existing technologies. I'm not inventing a new technology. The world as it exists today, we have to look at fossil fuels. 2 years ago, there was a theory that there was a renaissance of fossil fuels in the Atlantic Basin. That was based, as was said here, on the shale revolution, shale oil revolution, on the Canadian tar sands, just a bit early, a bit more expensive, and the southern Atlantic oil frontier, especially the ultra-deepwater Brazil pre-salt. So it was a given that if you projected production that was happening between 2010 and 2012, 13, this part of the world would be a net exporter of fossil fuels to the rest of the world. This would be a game change in politics, in geopolitics, you name it. Well, things were partly mismanaged and partly affected profoundly by the foreign oil prices in the second half of 2014, and that's obviously a topic for discussion. I won't talk much longer about that, because this is an issue, because the cost of production of this frontier technology, be it ultra-deep water in Brazil or most of the fields in the United States, shows a bit of a different problem, because it has a wide variation of cost efficiencies. Tar sands, certainly more expensive. They are, at present prices, with different complications. Each one has a complication. Bigger complication, in my view, is the ultra-deep water. We have 6 years of production period between the first, when you start playing, and then we have production. And it's a much more capital-intensive game. It's a more complicated thing. I'll leave that for discussion. So I don't think you can project that as you could 2 years ago in the future, because there's this big question mark, especially how to finance it south of the equator. And to finish it, there's a tension also between how long these prices of oil will be kept, because there is a fiscal problem in countries such, maybe only Qatar and Kuwait can bear $50. All the rest will go bust fiscally given time. Some are already. So this tension between increased efficiency on the Atlantic production, be it shale oil or ultra-deep water production, and how much can the Arab countries which are leading this foreign oil price, I'm not talking about the dollar is also helping, the appreciation of the dollar is also helping the oil prices, but the supply shock, how long can these countries sustain these prices at below 60, 70 levels, which will make life more comfortable for the Atlantic Basin producers? So it's a yes, but.
A yes, but. Rolake, what do you think?
Well, I think I want to play devil's advocate. I think no. And perhaps I need to put some color on that. The Atlantic Basin, whatever that is, and depending on how you define it and how far below or above the equator you go as well, doesn't operate in isolation. One of the biggest trends we've seen, and particularly from the continent on which I work and where I come from, is the role of Asia and Asia Pacific in driving global demand trend. And Asia is not part of the Atlantic Basin. And we know China has been one of the biggest stories, particularly for African energy, China and India. And they have huge implications for what happens, particularly on the demand side. And now we've seen with global prices in a bit of a rout, one of the biggest shifts we've seen, apart from the supply side shocks we've seen with shale oil and gas, has been the fact that the Chinese economy is gradually moving away from being sort of energy intensive to focusing more on domestic consumption. And that has huge implications for the rest of the world. So whilst there's been a focus on what is happening with on conventionals in North America, it's quite difficult to speak of an Atlantic system when you have all these other actors, including OPEC, which is a basket of different actors. But one thing I will say is that you do have Atlantic energy hubs, and you're seeing a shift in trade patterns, but they're extremely fluid, they're extremely dynamic, and I think for that very reason, I don't think such a system exists.
What's the difference between a hub and a system?
Sorry. Well, I'll give you an example.
No, I'm just...
I can go into a bit more detail. He asked what's the difference between a hub and a system. A system implies sort of an overarching, as you described it earlier when we were talking, an overarching czar, some sort of institution or body that is quite static and doesn't evolve. And I like to think of it more as hubs. So for instance, with Africa, I remember when I was in university back in the early 2000s, and you'd sit in all these very intellectual conversations, and professors would say, by the year 2015, the US would be importing 20% of its energy consumption from Africa. Where are we today with that? That picture has completely changed. India has become the largest importer of crude oil from sub-Saharan Africa, particularly West Africa. We're also seeing emerging trade patterns within Africa itself, where the US is now exporting refined petroleum products in the form of gasoline to the West Africa hub. You have trade patterns between Mozambique and South Africa to the gas pipeline. Those are in the southern Atlantic. So to speak of a sort of a static system that's not evolved, when we eventually live in a world that's determined, apart from geopolitical factors, by markets, the fundamental theories and basics of supply and demand, I think it's quite hard to speak of a system. I think that's what I mean. There are little hubs of activity going on, but a lot of the factors have become quite mixed up.
That's an interesting point, because I'm going to turn to Amina here, because Rolake, Amina, talks about little hubs of activity. There are some interesting things happening here in Morocco, some of which you're responsible for. Do you see that as just a little hub of activity, or do you see it much larger, not just here, but throughout the continent?
No, the problem is that Morocco has succeeded in clarifying a vision of development of the energy sector. Despite being not producer country, we have put on a clear strategy on the short, medium, and long term, with clear objectives of securing our energy system by diversifying our mix, and we are choosing all the sources in our energy mix with new coal plant, gas, but mainly with the development of renewable energy. And Morocco has launched two big main programs in 2009, a solar plan and a wind plan of 2,000 megawatt. that is considered right now in the MENA region and also internationally as a model of development. And this model of development is helping Morocco create a very, very large also in the industrial integration, development of its human resources, because we considered all those projects as integrated programs and not only putting on capacity of production. And that's the way how our countries in the south have to deal with their energy system, to use them to create industries and to create employment and to create specific development all around the supply of energy. And as it has been seen on the last years, all the big financial institutions are considering the Moroccan model as very interesting and to be developed in other areas of the world.
And in fact, I understand that there's some news coming up on that in about a month.
Yes, because the solar plan launched in 2009 is aiming 2,000 megawatt by 2020, and the first plan, which is developed in the area of Ouarzazate, is in the final process of being producing by the end of the year, and maybe its official inauguration. So that will be a great moment because it's one of the biggest solar plants in the world, 160 megawatt in a project of 500 in the same area to go to the 2,000 megawatt by 2020.
I think this is a good place to get the audience involved again with your Spot Me devices. Let's try to do a word cloud on the different types of fuel that you see. What type of energy for the future of the Atlantic Basin? When you think of energy for the Atlantic Basin, what type of energy are you thinking? What comes to mind? Just one word. And you've got 42 seconds. We're seeing gas, getting a lot of attention, solar, renewables. Solar, gas, biofuels, oil. – 15 seconds. Solar. 7, 6, final, 2, 1.
That's not fair. Renewable and renewables are the same thing.
You're seeing wind, gas. Rolake, when you look at that, what's that tell you?
Again, it goes back to this, I'm going back to Africa. So one of the interesting things about the North-South dialogue around energy, and particularly sustainability in Africa, has been this push for Africa to leapfrog, move to the green age. But then I think about the actual data that we see in front of us, 440 trillion cubic feet in gas reserves in East Africa alone. Hydrocarbons discoveries across the West Africa Transform margin, the pre-salt offshore region of Angola. And I'm thinking to myself, are governments and policymakers going to suddenly abandon exploiting hydrocarbons to move to green technology? And so whilst I think solar and renewables are part of the plan for the 60% of Africans without access to energy and electricity, I think the renewable story is just only going to be part of it. The real question we should be asking is how we harness the revenues that we do receive from the exploitation of fossil fuels into more sustainable forms of development. And I think for me, given the context in which I work, there's a bit of a mismatch. So I'm a big advocate of green technology, but it's not mutually exclusive to the fossil fuel story. And I think for continents that like Africa and countries in Africa that have a real immediate short-term need, there's a need to tackle more sustainable ways of exploiting fossil fuels. I know that sounds like talking about clean coal. It sounds very contradictory, but I think there's a need to really think about that, and particularly with the way the policy agenda for renewables is being pushed on a continent. When we look at the climate change debate, we all agree Africa, by far, is the smallest contributor in terms of carbon emissions, but suffers the most. In that sense, yes, we should support the green agenda, but from an economic imperative perspective, I think the debate is essentially highly skewed.
Let me have Winston come in here. Winston, you saw the result of the word cloud. Rolake talks about trying to do more with fossil fuels. You spent a lot of time working in Brazil and examining what's happening there. There's a lot of fossil fuels. What do you think? Do you see that as not sufficiently tapped? There's a lot more potential there?
There's a potential. I said in my first intervention, there's a huge potential, but I also said that given technologies, you cannot choose. I mean, you can have both. You can have the maximum renewable you have at a reasonable cost because they are less cost efficient for, in general, less cost efficient forms of energy. But you need, for the bulk of demand, you certainly need fossil fuels as far as I can see. So it's, in terms of security, fossil fuels are perhaps more important than renewables. So renewables is very nice for technology and for paving the way to the future, for a clean future. But fossil fuels is what you have to take care so that the lights will stay on. So this is very important. And I think we've messed up in Brazil big way with our policy, our regulation, and I don't think we delivered the supply of fossil fuels we could have in the pre-salt. So the potential of the pre-salt was mismanaged by the stoppage of the auctions for 5 years while the government re-regulated the thing, and now the problems related to the financing of Petrobras. So I think the contribution it could have given to the Atlantic will be at least delayed by many years because of mismanagement. The answer to the question is there's no choice between renewables and non-renewables. Obviously, renewables are nicer, but you have to keep pumping the bad stuff.
And I want to go to the audience in a minute, but so if you have your questions ready, but I wanted to ask Robin a question about whether Africa can do this by itself. I know there have been a number of initiatives from whether it's Europe, Africa, the US, in fact, Asia, and also some I know are Africa generated. But do you think this is something that Africa needs considerable global help to make happen?
To develop all its energy or develop renewables?
All of its energy.
Well, I mean, clearly it needs international investment. Oil and gas, one of the things that's very important, renewables can be very effective, particularly in what's called distributed energy. The panel earlier was talking about these remote areas to put solar in. Makes a lot of sense. It's like cell phones. You don't have to have a grid. You can jump a whole generation. But most people are going to live in cities, frankly, in Africa, and it's going to be hydrocarbons, which is going to fuel those cities. And the key fuel here for Africa, which frankly Africa's managed very badly, is natural gas. They have enormous reserves of natural gas. And there's a famous photograph of the world, and Kazakhstan, West Africa, and the Bakken, which is in South Dakota, are all lit up at night because they're flaring all this gas. They're just wasting the gas. And there's a question of management of these resources. They can unlock enormous amounts of energy. They can unlock money. But one of the questions is going to be how they manage it. And frankly, a lot of these, the gas business particularly requires markets. And it requires massive investments. And each little African country doesn't have the scale. And so they should find a way to create, we were discussing this earlier, an authority or something, so particularly in West Africa, you could unleash enormous amounts of economic activity. There's one other thing that's very important, remember about renewables. You know, even in Africa, the sun doesn't shine all the time, and the wind doesn't always blow. So what do? You either have interrupted supplies, or you can use natural gas as basically to provide base load, to have the predictable, reliable supplier. And that's the way to manage renewables, I think, particularly in urban areas and things like this where you have massive demand. But clearly, the international community has to be involved. They have to bring technology, they have to bring capital, but governments have a critical role in terms of the management of this, because governments own the resource. It's the patrimony of the country.
I know that Winston wanted to get a piece of this. Before I bring you in, I just wanted to encourage those of you who are setting your comments up through SpotMe to continue doing so, because they're really fascinating as I read them, and I'll point some of you out in a little bit. But Winston, you wanted to come in here.
Just a footnote on Africa and gas and power. I think gas can play an important role in Africa and may may actually play because it exists. So supply creates its own demand in a way. But hydro, Brazil, for instance, Brazil is a very nice example, I think, for Africa. Brazil grew by leaps and bounds only based on hydro. Brazil today is still 80% hydro in terms of power production. So now gas started to do an indent, but we're still going to go hydro for a long time. And hydro is clean energy. And Africa has an enormous hydro potential. The problem here is the problem we had even in Brazil, is to integrate the systems. And now there's, today in the morning, someone said there's 54 countries. It's very difficult to build one big dam for one country, which is small. So we have to have scale. So this kind of institutional problem has to be solved. But it's very important to take note that hydropower is a fantastic way of growing your system in a cheap way if capital is available for the big works. So, but I think you are right in saying that gas will appear, will push the system, but in an efficient way, especially from an environmental point of view. I think the hydro solution for Africa will be ideal, but it's pretty complicated politically, I think.
Terrific. Let's go. There's a first question over here. If you can please stand up and tell us who you are. Oh, I'm sorry.
No problem, no problem. So, hello everybody. My name is Ayoub Mamdou. I'm from Morocco. I have two questions. The first one, I was a little bit surprised while we are talking about like clean energy, etc. And we say that maybe not clean energy because economically it's not that viable. Are we always continuing to have this kind of speech, or are we changing for something? Yesterday we had this the discussion about climate change. Shall we change something about the speech? And second thing, what does it mean, clean energy? Because like 10 years ago, we were talking about biofuels, and biofuels, we saw that it has a repercussion on food security, and we had the wind energy that has some like impact on the speed of the globe, etc., etc. So what can we clearly say that is clean energy? Second question is for Mrs. Benkhadra. We saw this week the Guardian article about the solar program, etc., etc., and we talked about it. Is Morocco planning to be a regional energy superpower, or can it be, first of all, and then is it planning to do it?
So for the first question, it's necessary to explain that the security of supply will need all the kind of source of energy, fossil fuels and renewable energy. We have seen until now the predominance of fossil fuels, and with the problem of sustainable development and climate change, the development of renewable energy is increasing faster and is becoming more and more competitive right now for the wind and very soon for the solar. And you need to mix between those two energies because, as has been said before, solar is not shining all the day and wind is not growing every day. So those renewable energy have to be considered in a mix with basic energy, which comes from gas or from coal. But right now we are profiting from the availability of gas to develop more and more gas everywhere in the world. So, and what we are going to see, and what the IEA says, that in 2035 and beyond 2050, the energy mix in the world, which was more than 82% from fossil fuels and other energies, fossil fuels will still be important in this mix, but will be lower to 75%, and renewable energy will increase very sharply, but the two are in the mix in the future. And if we can accelerate the technology, the storage of energy coming from solar, maybe we can take more for renewable energy in the energy mix. Considering the second question of Morocco, is Morocco going to be a regional supply power? First, we have to notice that Morocco has a very interesting geographical position, very close to Europe, to sub-Saharan countries, and is interconnected to Spain, to Algeria, and is working on the reinforcement of interconnection in the south to Mauritania, and why not to the other sub-Saharan countries to create a large integrated market. Morocco is pushing to increase the integration in this area of the world because it's in the interest of all the country to have better security supply, is working on its infrastructures, but all the strategy we has developed was first to meet our own needs, because the needs for energy is growing very fast, and all the plan that have been done is first for our needs. But we have been also working with European countries, with Spain, with France and others, to work on the integration, more integration and interconnection, because Morocco can be in the future a supplier to Europe to meet their European Union directive of 20% of renewable energy by 2020. But this will need more legal, technical works between all those countries in the Mediterranean. And we keep optimistic that that will be a solution for the future, and new capacities can be added for green energy.
Thank you very much. There's a question. Thank you.
Rabia Mukhtar, Texas A&M and OCP Policy Center. The World Bank issued a report on thirsty energy 6-7 months ago. The US Department of Energy has also released several reports on the water energy nexus, because they're concerned about the water footprint for the energy. And yet, nobody has mentioned it, and there was a talk about shale gas, which is, the concern is about water quality, water quantity, and the water footprint. In general, where do you see the water footprint of these energy technologies in the new transformation of energy sector? Where do you see that going in the Atlantic?
Robin?
In terms of shale in particular, this is something the industry is acutely conscious of. And that I think what the system that they would like to create is almost a closed system where the well really doesn't use, they would inject the water and keep reusing it and bring it out and clean it and redo. So this is one of the things about the energy business. It's a huge business, and that I keep coming back to, it's driven by economics. And if the companies are forced, if the industry is forced to do things, they'll find solutions. If they don't have to, they won't. And I think that the serious companies know that if they're going to develop shale, particularly outside the United States, in South Africa, for example, the shale program was blocked by farmers over concern of water. And so water clearly is a concern. The other question is, there's an enormous amount of water, in the world, and that the oil industry handles a lot of that and can affect, and a lot of water comes out of wells. And can they do more to clean that water and make it potable or usable for agriculture? So the industry is very conscious of this. And it's also one of the great risks to the industry. You heard about the BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Well, the other absolutely terrifying environmental risk is to pollute an aquifer. That would be a fiasco of huge proportions for any company.
My name is Usman Shehu, a journalist from Germany. I would like to ask the panelists, how do you look at the growing population in Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, how it is affecting development like energy? For example, if you have a local government chairman who have a budget of 1,000 people in his area, before the end of the year, due to the lot of productivity or the way people have kids that they cannot be able to feed, before the end of the year, this population is increased to over 1,200. In Africa, I think one of the problems, we deliver kids that we cannot feed. I think Africa needs to start to think, I need kids that I can be able to sponsor for school, I can be able to take care of their household, I can be able to take care of their upbringing. For example, in Nigeria, you find somebody having 50 kids. You find somebody have 15 kids, 60 kids, 20 kids. This person, he doesn't earn $200 a day. So how can he be able, each child to have electricity in his house? How can he be able to have hot water? How can he be able to pay this money? It is a topic, I think, in Africa when you discuss about family planning or whatever, the imam and the pastor said no. But we have to start thinking that we need to have kids that we can be able to take care of their responsibility. Thank you.
Rolake?
Right. I think, I'm sort of trying to contextualize the question. I thought I understood where you were going initially, but then I think I wanted to separate two very issues. The choice of family planning, those are two completely issues. The burden of populations and demography on limited infrastructure is a completely separate thing, and particularly where energy access and supply is concerned. And I would say, perhaps going back to the question that was asked around clean energy, the point is, many African countries, as you allude to, have a problem with urbanization and rapid population growth. And in terms of determining and tailoring energy access or supply solutions to specific communities, off-grid, on-grid, I think that's going to have to take place very much at government level, at policy level. I'll give you an example. Fossil fuel subsidies are still in operation across many African countries. There's a real conflict there with transition to cleaner energy systems. And they are there because they are national economic imperatives that need to be met around cushioning the bottom of the pyramid and those who would otherwise fall off the radar if those didn't exist. When you're having conversations about clean energy transitions, I think there needs to be a much more nuanced approach to understanding what specific economic, social context new technologies have been deployed. In terms of infrastructure, I do think there is a place for distributed energy systems off-grid that tap into transit sources of energy, such as solar. So I really see a mix and match. In terms of infrastructure, I also think there's prospects for regional collaboration that helps to address some of these issues. I saw one of my friends there, Fabrice, one of the questions he posed was around hydro projects. And one of the ones I wanted to talk about actually was the Bui Dam. That's being one of the big large-scale energy projects in Africa. Those have their places, the large-scale stuff, but many of these actually fail to provide access to those who I call at the bottom of the pyramid. Very laudable project, very commercial, potentially good returns, but I do think there's a place for that in terms of big industries that are end users, and there needs to be solutions that are tailored to those who are off the grid and off the map. We often see that statistics about the 2 million deaths from biomass use every year globally. I think that's a situation that's unsustainable and could well benefit from transition to clean fuels. The final point I wanted to make was around gas. And you talked quite eloquently about the lack of access for markets for gas in Africa. I do think that picture is changing. You are seeing governments from Tanzania to Mozambique to Nigeria revising tariffs, particularly gas prices. But you often have this conflict between the commercial imperatives. And so, for instance, in Nigeria, the government introduced a domestic supply obligation known as the DSO, which offered tax breaks and incentives to companies that directed a portion of their production for local uses, whether for petrochemicals, fertilizers. But there's still a disparity in the economics. If you're going to supply LNG in Asian markets under term contract or spot contract, you'd probably get higher prices, perhaps not as high as you'd have got 10 years ago at $16 per MMBTU, but you certainly would benefit from much more attractive economics. And those are the sorts of engagements I think both the private sector and governments need to be sitting around the table having in order to really tackle this energy problem. But I think for Africa, the fossil fuel debate cannot be had in isolation, and the clean energy debate cannot be had in isolation.
There's a question on this side of the room.
Thank you. So I'm Pablo. I'm from American League. So a quick question. I think that hydrocarbon system actually exists in Atlantic. If you remember Pangea, we used to be together. So what you find in Brazil pre-salt is what you have in Angola. What you have gas in Africa, you have gas in South America. And actually, that's a strategy for people to go for hydrocarbons. But speaking about renewables, I think perhaps I'm too much of a realist. But I think that low oil prices is the worst news for renewables. The opportunity cost of trying to go and switch to them is going to be higher. So I think that that's something just to keep in mind, because everything sounds like, well, renewables are great. However, you mentioned economics are key for that, and then can you actually rely on them? So I think that gas is actually quite a better option if you may. I'm not saying let's not go for renewables, but being a realist, I think that gas will be the key. I don't know if you agree with that going forward.
Well, there's one of the questions up here that said, the panel's talking too much about oil and gas. The future is renewables. Well, with all due respect, I keep going back and back. Is it scalable and is it economic? And given existing technology and given existing economics, there are real limits to what renewables can do. It's not to say that we shouldn't be trying to exploit them or encourage them, I think renewables have a critical role to play, particularly in distributed energy, particularly outside big cities. But I think that hydrocarbons are going to play a critical role. One of the things we haven't talked about very much, really at all, is climate change. I think that natural gas and renewables is actually a very, very powerful combination over time. But it's going to take time. And you know, people talk about renewables, but remember, in Africa, a lot of renewables right now is wood and dung. I mean, and this is there's huge, there are tremendous structural problems that have to be overcome. And this takes it's going to take a lot of investment. It's going to take further technology. And again and again and again, it's going to take good government regulation and stewardship.
There's a question here.
Thank you. Simon Garapin from Portugal. Well, I'd like to address the panel in the sense that something we saw in this area is volatility. At the end of the day, we spend years hearing about, well, a kind of apocalyptic disappearance of, or rise of prices, everything. And suddenly, with the shale oil in the United States, you have a completely change suddenly. My question would be, first, is it possible to find a model that could deal with this kind of volatility that at the end of the day puts all the prophecies that are done by very, very good experts and books, well, at the end of the day are worth nothing? And the second question, more detailed, is what you think the electric car in the long run is going to affect the gasoline markets? Thank you.
Why don't we take that, Winston?
Yeah. So you've seen the rates of return in the E&P industry. They're very high. And risk and return are totally correlated. So what you say is that this is a very risky business. I mean, you don't know exactly what's below the ground. You know whether the day you find something, your neighbor will find something much better than you. So it's intrinsic, a very risky business. I'm talking mainly of fossil fuels. Okay? So this is of the nature of the game. This is going to continue. It's very difficult to predict. Now, 2 years ago, we had a clear prediction based on supply, on engineering, on geology, which was temporarily falsified, I'm talking about the Atlantic Basin, by a political decision from some Arab countries. But this is a different environment we're in. I think that there's going to be a continuous growth of supply in the medium term from the area, but short-term prophecies in the industry, if you would nail them, you'd be very rich.
Rolake, you wanted to get a piece of that. We'll have Rolake, and then we'll have you, Robin.
Okay.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question about volatility, and I run out of a number of times of asking to predict oil prices. I think sometimes we talk about it as if it's something new. I think the one game changer has been technology, and that happens in any. You could argue that shale has been a kind of disruptive technology, which perhaps not everybody saw coming. I think some people did. But if you look at the cycles, the commodity cycles we've had over the last 20, 30 years, long before, and even further back then, you know, someone once said bear runs typically last for 20 years and bull runs are typically 7 years, and we're about 7 years into the current bear run, so you do the math. I think what it suggests is the things we take for granted, the signals and indicators of predicting demand and supply, have totally been thrown off the map because there's this excess supply that no one really knows what to do with. And the way it affects governments and institutions and commercial operators, very different. I'll give you an example. In my country, we benchmark our budget yearly on an oil price budget benchmark. You can imagine for fiscal and economic planning, that's been thrown out of the water. However, for low-cost producers, you know, cost of production off Gulf of Guinea and West Africa have been falling significantly. The technology has actually had unintended consequences because it's been translated from the North Atlantic and brought to bear in more difficult frontier plays in Africa. And finally, you have a situation where net importers of petroleum products in Africa are now starting to question the rationale for subsidizing fossil fuels because prices have dropped so low. So we're in a world where you have this mix of actors who are feeling both the benefits and the cons of the oil price. And I think because we're seeing a fundamental structural change, very much different to what we saw in 2008, which was primarily financial crisis driven, and that downturn lasted only a few months and prices recovered. There's been, I wouldn't call it necessarily a seismic shift, but something somewhat of a seismic shift, and I think we should brace ourselves for impact pretty much and come up with adaptation strategies.
Robin?
I want to add to that. When oil prices are high, there's massive investment in technology. And that's one area where technology is not static. And, there was North American shale was one feature, but there's also politics enters into the oil business. And the price of oil went up in the late 70s when OPEC nationalized the resources of a lot of countries in the Middle East and North Africa, Brazil, Venezuela, places like that. Then prices went up. There were breakthroughs in technology in the North Sea and places like that. And Alaska, production surged, prices crashed. And so, I mean, it's always dynamic. But again, going back to where I began my comments today, this is all a function of technology, markets, regulation, politics, all these different factors. And they're all interacting, and it's not predictable.
Well, where's Baki or Baku, who would ask a question? Yeah, Baku, there you are. I wanted to ask you to ask your question. That.
Just read it?
Yes.
I'm sorry. My question was actually asked right after the cloud response, and I think Rolake, am I saying your name right? I think a lot of the dialogue focuses on the bigger picture, and I think when you are involved in on a daily basis in seeing the lack of access to energy, I think you know, for me, I was just curious as to what everybody's thinking was in the response to that question, because I felt like a lot of it came from people wanting to solve an immediate need, within the energy sector and access to, affordable energy.
Let me ask Amina, do you think that it was people trying to solve an immediate need?
I agree, and we all, I think, agree that access to energy is the big challenge for our southern countries, and especially in sub-Saharan countries. And solutions are not all big projects, and we have to think locally, because there are solutions that can be adaptable to the needs of people in rural areas, in remote areas, with very simple technology. So we need, in all the South, and especially in our continent, to think locally, nationally, and regionally. Locally, to bring very easily the best solutions at the best competitive price to people for pumping water, for the lighting of their rooms, etc. Nationally, when you have to secure security of supply for cities, and regionally to share the resources when you have big dam, as it has been said before, or when you have big discoveries and you can use it for several countries and work together in an integration vision. So all this is necessary, and the local solutions are a priority, because we can do a lot for those people who have not access to electricity right now, who are using the worst means of energy.
There's a question here.
Masai Shia, I'm Ambassador of Japan to NATO. My question is about a word I couldn't find in the crowd, and Marcus is asking the same question, nuclear. What is your view about the role of nuclear energy in your system or hub, whatever you call it? I know we made the situation difficult 4 years ago by Fukushima, but I can still ask this question because we have just reopened the 2 reactors, having adopted the highest possible safety standard. And it's CO2-free. And also the situation at the time of the Fukushima globally was 30% came from coal, 30% came from nuclear, the rest 6% comes others. So it's a little bit unrealistic to assume that the renewable can take care of not only the drop of coal, but also nuclear. That means 60%.
Nuclear, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, well, nukes have three problems. One is obviously the fear of the potential environmental shock. The second is cost of capital. It's huge, and it takes a long time to build the thing as well. But so for developing countries, it's quite complicated. Although there are lots of very nice supplier credits, etc., from the producing countries, it's in a way, it looks like an inefficient way of addressing the problem. Maybe the big countries like Brazil will need, unfortunately, to do that if they don't take care of the supply of other sources on time. But it's an emergency thing. I don't think that nuclear will be a fundamental, firm base supply of energy because of high cost of capital and because of lots of opposition. By the way, you have to dispose of the stuff after that, which creates problems.
I wanted to take another question. Jim Colby, I know he has several, but if you can stand up for a second, if you can get the microphone. You've asked several really good questions, and whichever you think is the best that you've posted.
Well, not the one that's up there. It seems to me that if we're going to have a real breakthrough we need a real breakthrough in energy storage if we're going to have increased reliance on renewables. We talk a lot here about renewables, but how realistic is it when we have not made a really major breakthrough in storage? Electricity is the one commodity that you have to have the moment you turn it on. You have to use it. It doesn't get stored, it gets used. Storage is in some kind of battery or something else that may not even be thought of yet. So how realistic is it we're going to have a major breakthrough in storage that allows us to have increased use of renewables?
I remind you that water is storable. So people forget that hydro, which is the most important source of renewable energy, is storable. That's a nice thing. The rest is basically technology. I'm not saying current. The problem is some people will do, but the cost efficiency of these things, nobody actually can say things. It's all about cost-efficient subsidies. By the way, John, the discussion about caring for the needs of the people in isolated villages, etc., it can be done. It's like you subsidize food. You can subsidize energy. Solar system for a small number of people is excellent. If you have the sun, obviously, because it doesn't have maintenance cost. It has obviously a capital cost, but it's not that big. It works. Nobody has to take much care of it. So you can do, but it's a matter of cost now. But storing electricity, I think something still way to the future for a large-scale thing, except dams.
Because there's several other questions. We don't have a tremendous amount of time, but I just wanted to...
I'll be short then. If you're looking at energy, there's basically three sources of it. You can dig it out of the ground. You can harvest it from your environment, which, as many of you have pointed out, is complicated and expensive, although the cost is coming down. But there's a third option, which we tend to forget. You can grow it. And Africa, over half of the population, is in one way or another using grown energy. You called it dismissively wood and dung, but for the foreseeable future, this is the main source of energy that hundreds of millions of people are going to use. Now, the way they're using it today is harvesting from the wild, and they're degrading their environment doing so. Integrating the growing of those energy sources into the farming systems of Africa is a quick, easy, low-cost win to ensure that that particular energy supply is being met. Let's remember that energy is a fundamentally dynamic thing. We're talking nuclear, we're talking fossil fuels of one kind or another, we're talking renewable, but whatever the picture looks like today, it will not look like that in 5 years' time, and in 20 years' time, it will look completely different. I would advise strongly against saying no to any of these sources of energy. We need whatever fossil is left, we need nuclear, we need renewables, we need biomass, and we need to get away from the most polluting sources of energy and towards the least polluting sources of energy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Amina, did you want to talk about that, and as well as the previous question?
No, I was thinking about the storage. Just to remember that in this sector, the evolution of technology have created regularly large revolutions. What we are exploiting right now in deep offshore was not possible 20 years ago. What we are doing in several areas have been done due to the development of technology with new ways of interpretation, with 3D seismic, with new FPSOs for the production on the deep offshore. So we are confident in this sector that next revolutions will bring next steps, and in the storage, it will be the same case. For instance, in our case in Morocco, for this big solar plant that is under construction, and it has been divided in phases of 160 megawatt of cylindro-parabolic solar, 150 with tower solar, etc. And between, on the last 3.5 years. And between the first tender and the third tender, we had technology where storage was improved from 4.5 hours to almost 7 hours. So technology is in evolution, and there will be innovations, and the capacity of storage will increase certainly in the future, as it has been done in other areas of energy.
Before we take the question over here, I wanted to bring Robin in here. I know the question talked about you dismissing wood and dung. Do you want to make a pass at that?
Biofuels properly managed are great. A lot of the current energy usage in Africa and certain other remote areas has led to the deforestation and desertification. It's an economic and ecological fiasco. That's what I was talking about. If you can change it, great. But one of the things also, one of the problems with biofuels is people simply do not understand the scale of the energy industry. An offshore platform costs $6 or $8 billion and takes 10 years, and it will produce 200,000 barrels of oil a day, whatever it is. In the United States, with the biofuel industry, it's very interesting. They like to talk about gallons per year. In the oil industry, we talk about barrels per day. So the ethanol industry will say, well, it's going to be million barrels a year. And you go, wow, that's a big number. And you say, excuse me, could we please divide it by the number of gallons in a barrel? And could we please divide that by 365? And the number goes down like that. And so people, and I'm not trying to be difficult, it's just the scale of this industry is so enormous. And you talk to some people to get biofuels on a scalable basis, the amount of just biomass that you'd have to handle is simply staggering. It creates whole new environmental problems. So I'm not dismissing anything, but every alternative has its challenges. That's my only point.
Rolake, you want to get into this before we bring out questions?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to get into 2 points, and one of the points that I think had been missing, I think we haven't talked about funding for a lot of these energy projects, whether it's the off-grid, and for someone who comes from a finance background as well, I think the availability of technology and supply is often a function of the ability of governments and the private sector to pull together the funds for many of these projects, whether they be on the sustainable end of scale or on the fossil fuels end of the scale. And I think it's an important debate that needs to be had. And particularly for Africa, the World Bank talks about $42 billion for Africa to improve its energy access rates. And I think that's a very significant issue, which is a large part of the chain, and which all these other factors, such as regulation, transparency, do impact. And I think for Africa, that's probably one of the weakest links. And then the point I wanted to sort of address that Jim made on storage, I think based on the experience and a lot of conversations I've been having, recently we were asked to comment on what we thought the relevance of the Tesla battery solution would be for Africa. And the immediate red flag there was cost. If you know anything about African societies, particularly the grassroots level, shared utilities, whether that's water, electricity, are often a large part of how communities live and access these resources. So the question is, it's all well and good storage, but it needs to go hand in hand in a renewable energy solution. And as long as you have batteries that are, $3,000 for the Powerwall or one of these devices, it's not really immediately translatable to the context in which many of us work. It doesn't make sense from a cost perspective. It's bad enough that consumers at the bottom of the pyramid are complaining about electricity prices, but I think storage solutions are probably a bit further down the line, and I think I need to see the technology evolve over time and see what might be adaptable to the African context. Yeah.
If we can go here and then we'll come back. There's a question right here.
Thank you. Fidel Santagorta, Ministry of Foreign Affairs from Spain. I have a question for Mr. Robin West about the coincidence between two trends across the Atlantic. One is, as you know, the first cargoes of American gas will start arriving to Europe, including Spain, early next year. And the other one is that due to the crisis in Ukraine, the European Union is promoting an integrated energy market, including through interconnections. Do you think this is a durable, relevant trend for the future?
Well, what you're really talking about is it's the gas business and the liquefied natural gas business, which is changing the business. Gas markets, there is a global oil market. Oil is a fungible commodity. It's in a transparent market. You can move barrels of oil around, and it's very simple. Natural gas didn't used to work like that. It was very regional. You had the European market, you had the North American market, and you had the Asian market, which was largely serviced by pipelines. Now what's happening is you're starting to move more and more gas, liquefied natural gas. And one of the things which is where you supercool gas, it's put on ships and moved over and then it's liquefied, put on a ship, and then regasified. What's going to happen, I think, is that you're going to have an increasing trade. One of the things that where the United States in these LNG projects are huge projects. Some friends from Shell there, they are building a ship called the Project Prelude that is 4 times the size of an aircraft carrier to have offshore liquefied natural gas production. I mean, the scale of all this is almost unimaginable. What's happened, though, with the United States is that gas is produced all over the country and then it's brought to these terminals and just sold. Now, sometimes it's sold on long-term contracts, sometimes it'll be sold on spot contracts. The U.S. coming to the market has changed the nature of this business. In the past, if you wanted to develop Nigerian LNG or Angolan LNG or any of these other projects, you had to have long-term commitments from the buyers, and then you financed the project off that. Now with the United States, there's going to be these spot cargoes, and it's really changing the dynamic of the business. And one of the most interesting situations is actually what happened in, I think it's Latvia, where Lithuania, excuse me, I stand corrected. The Russians were gouging them on gas prices. And the Lithuanians brought an LNG receiving ship. They brought it in, and the price of gas from Russia promptly went down by 40%. So it's becoming a traded, more fungible commodity. One of the things also that in terms of in the United States, when we talk about energy security, we're really talking about oil. That's from the oil shock of '73 and the '70s. In Europe, energy security really meant gas, and it meant the threat from Russia. And what's happening now, though, is that with LNG, with more receiving terminals, and the other thing in Europe is they're putting in a grid of pipelines. In the past, the old Russian system moved gas from east to west, but the system you couldn't move gas north and south, and so particularly southeastern Europe was isolated. But now what's happening is that they're building a real grid so you can move gas around, you can have reversible pipelines. There's something else that happened which is a real game changer. I guess it was announced earlier this month. Eni has made a huge gas discovery off Africa. Now it's in the Mediterranean off Egypt. But you have a lot of gas in Israel, you have a lot of gas in Egypt, and what you're going to see is this business is going to start changing. And now one of the problems is that the European utility industry is completely fragmented, and that it's not a unified market. You have Spanish utilities and French utilities and German and the Russians, and everybody's slugging it out. And so it's not an efficient, transparent market. A lot of these problems would go away if there was just a unified market. So anyway, that is a long-winded answer to your question, which is, my answer would be yes.
Thank you, Robert. Unfortunately, we don't have a tremendous amount of time left, but we'll take maybe 2 final questions before we have the panelists wrap up. There's a question right here.
I feel that there's a lot of technical talk and not a lot of focus on human behavior behind this, whether it's at the African domestic government level where until these cleaner fuels are being seen as more than just a hobby or something nice and new, and people are putting the political will to make investments for scalable projects, it's not going to happen. And so we're going to keep on coming each year and discussing all these renewables, but we're forgetting the human behavior, the vested interest in a place like Nigeria where people are making a lot of money from diesel and generators, and until you can get the bad grid users to have a shift, it's not going to be economical enough for the off-grid users to have any sort of supply. And I feel that we spend a lot of time talking about the technicals, but actually the human behavior behind it really needs to be looked into with a microscope. And our African governments need to take charge on their own and stop waiting for the West to come and give them solutions on renewables, because if we have to use our gas, then we should use our gas. So, I mean, how do you think about the human behavior before you even begin to think about energy systems in this sense?
No, Rolake, you have some thoughts on that. Yeah.
Well, I wish I could quantify human behavior. I think I'd sum it up by talking about political will. Maybe that's a halfway house of describing it. I mean, I wouldn't say it's all. I'm a cautious optimist about this, and I'll give you some tangible examples. So one of the things that was said about Nigeria, if you look at the way the Nigerian economy is made up, huge oil exporter, massive importer of refined products. And then there were investors who wanted to come and invest in refineries. And everybody said, there's no way you're going to get refineries off the ground because those projects will be jeopardized, because they're vested interests who want to keep importing petroleum products because they benefit from the payment of subsidies they get to make up for the difference between the landed cost and the pump price of petrol. But guess what? There's something called enlightened self-interest. In the longer run, we are all better off. And we're seeing now much more interest because there's a government who is taking action, or at least seem to be taking action on those issues, wanting to tackle the leakages in the system. And there are those in the business and private sector sphere who are coming around to the idea. So I don't think it's necessarily all doom and gloom. What we do need is a critical mass of that political will. So we're seeing pockets of reform and pockets of very laudable initiatives that are being made, but what we're not seeing is this effort. And then these countries don't operate in isolation. I personally would like to see the continent of Africa talking about a certain level of continent-wide energy self-sufficiency. The Americans are taking care of themselves. They're moving towards a type of energy self-sufficiency. What we need to be doing is building regional markets to absorb what we produce. We're seeing that with the West Africa gas pipeline, the Mozambique-South Africa pipeline, but there's still a greater deal for regional integration, which would also reduce our vulnerability to external shocks or external seismic shifts in the global energy markets. So I think this political will, it needs much more of a momentum. I was quite pleased to see that the Sustainable Energy for All Fund has now set up an Africa Energy Leaders Group that's now bringing together the private sector and the public sector. But it's going to take a great deal of strong leadership. I alluded to the fact that yesterday we have very weak institutions. So we do need these individuals who have vision and a drive and also the courage to act in the face of vested interest.
Thank you very much. We'll take our last question and get your spot me devices. We'll have a question right after this question.
Oh, my name is João Bosco from Brazil. I've been in Cape Verde with 500,000 people, and Nigeria, 180 million people. Both of the countries, I had problem with electricity, lack of electricity. If you can go to other countries, we may find the same problem, right? So I was anxious to listen from the panelists, something about the private sector. And I heard something from you, from Rolake. You make something very briefly. So how can we invite the private sector to be involved in this solution? Because so far, it looks like the government are not able to do it, right? So if the answer is yes, we can invite the private sector. How can we convince the private sector to invest in those countries to solve this problem?
Robin, do you want to tackle that?
This goes back to where I began. This is all about resources, markets, regulation, technology, whatever. If the governments have to create opportunities for the private sector to invest. Now, you know, if you don't have resources, you know, it's tough. It's really tough if nobody thinks you have any oil and gas. The oil industry isn't going to invest. But if you can create incentives for people to come, assuming there's, you know, whether it's demand or whether it's, you know, resources for supply, it's to create an environment for that to work. But, you know, talking about human nature, I mean, a lot of people like to opine on energy. Energy is a very emotive subject now with climate, with all these things, and people feel very strongly, which is fine. But God is in the details on this stuff. I mean, this is complicated. We're talking about investing billions of dollars. And if the politicians aren't prepared to take it seriously, and once they've negotiated a deal, they're not prepared to keep their word. I mean, one of the things that's very difficult, if you say, well, would you please build a multi-billion-dollar whatever it is, and people believe that you're going to change the terms after it's built, they're not going to build it. So, and why should they? So anyway, I mean, I think that this, as I say, you're absolutely correct, but it's very technical. I apologize to members of the audience for getting all this gobbledygook, but the fact of the matter is, that's what this business is about. It's about details, huge details, but details.
Great, thank you, Robin. And I appreciate you sort of giving me a great segue to get us back to where we began, because I want us to go back to the question that we started with about different energy systems. Do you think that there's an energy system emerging in the Atlantic basin? So what, you've got 15 seconds to give us your answer. 12 seconds.
I would have been more interested to see the words that popped up. I think the words would have changed. You know, the other question, but anyway.
One, okay, let's see. Any change? Oh, I think it's probably it's gotten worse.
There is an emerging Atlantic
as we
system.
wrap up, I just want to give the panelists an opportunity, probably about 20 to 30 seconds, to please wrap up before we have to end. We'll start with you, Rob.
Yeah, the only other thing, we really didn't talk about climate at all. And climate is going to change energy. It's going to change in Africa. It's very important. But the key thing on climate and energy, again, it's all about markets. It's about price. If you don't find a way to price into carbon, there will be no progress. So you have to do that.
Amina?
I will speak about access to energy in difficult areas and say that it must be a priority of the governments before bringing private-public partnership. That government have to put this as one between their top priorities and found solutions locally, as I said, and nationally and regionally. And one important thing is there is not only North-South cooperation. We have to work, as His Majesty the King in Morocco is calling for, South-South cooperation. There are very important and interesting developments in several areas in the South countries, and we can share in a co-development and fair partnership those experiences with other countries with a win-win cooperation for the benefit of the population who are still lacking electricity and clean energy.
Thank you. Winston?
Many of the questions were about how to actually get energy, cheap energy, to the people, especially in Africa. So I would address this thing because I think the fundamental thing here is stability of incentives. I mean, the government won't do it alone. You have to bring private capital. That's a must. Whatever energy you think, renewable, non-renewable. And for that, you need stability of incentives, basically because politicians think very seriously about energy prices because the demand is totally inelastic. It's like food. People cannot live without food. They cannot live without energy. So that's a very political commodity in a way. So that's why regulation is unstable, because if it's changed, the price is going up, you change the regulation, then you disorientate all investment. So I think that's the experience we have in Africa, in Brazil, most places, perhaps except the United States, where the market works, more or less. So that's stability of incentives and bringing the private sector into all forms of energy. The big ball game of oil and gas to the solar small solutions is fundamental. We have to have stability of institutions, stability of incentives, good regulation. This is key.
Rolake.
I second everything that's been said. But the one thing I would say going into Paris and the climate change talks is there needs to be, I think it's probably one of the best chances we've had a while to reach some sort of global consensus on this issue. And I think there needs to be a strong recognition of the contributions of different players in parts of the world and a recognition of those who have the capacity to do more, so that when all parties come to the table on this issue, we actually see change and we see action going forward.
Thank you. Yeah. Two things. One, if you can join me in please thanking this terrific panel for their contribution. And secondly, an announcement from the OCP Foundation.
Well, from all together, so you had a long day, and you've been very resilient. I'm impressed. So this is just to convey you, on behalf of both organizers, to a gala dinner at the Mamounia Hotel. So it's a very nice place in Marrakesh, an hotel that dates back to the 1920s. We'll add some glamour, in fact, to this. So you should proceed on the left side here at the entrance and the conference center. There are buses waiting for you. And the night owls will be organized at the Mamounia, so you don't have to. So once you come back to sleep. Okay? Yeah. So thanks again, and see you soon at the gala dinner.
Thank you.